Brian's Winter, Chapter 17. He had fooled himself before. He had thought he'd heard planes when there were none. He imagined he saw people, had thought guns were going off when it was trees exploding. All wrong. And so now he thought of what it could be. It wasn't trees exploding, then what? He could think of nothing but a gun, unless somehow trees exploded when it got warm as well as when it got cold. He had neglected camp and spent all day cleaning the shelter, bringing in more wood, retightening the snowshoes, checking the bowstrings, and sharpening the hatchet and knife. It was still warm, so he put his sleeping bag out to air, and somehow, when he had done all these things, it was near dark and time to cook again and settle in for the night. But he was not tired, and all day while he worked around the camp, and then at dark, when he made a fire and started to cook, all that time he kept listening for the sound again, knowing it was warm and that it might not be trees, but not thinking past that, just listening, waiting. He did not hear it again. He lay awake looking at the coals, the warm glow lighting his face. When his eyes closed, he knew that the next day he must go and try to find the place where he'd heard the popping sounds. He thought it might be a good distance. The sounds were faint, and he would probably find some plausible reason for the sound. But he would look. He had to look. He awakened before dawn, made a small fire to cook stew, and then prepped his gear. He had forgotten the wolves, and he saw his lance and warbow and arrows, hung the hatchet and knife on a thong around his shoulder, and left camp just after good light. Brian knew it might be a waste trip and decided to swing past the wolf-killed moose. There had been 4 wolves, but it was a large moose, and there would probably be meat left over if the wolves were gone. He needn't have worried. The wolves had eaten off the rear end in the middle and were gone, but the back and shoulders were intact, and Brian made a mental note to swing around and start carrying meat back to the camp when he finished the search. The warm weather had softened the snow surface, and it had refroze during the night, so the snowshoes didn't sink in at all, but rode along the top. Brian found it was almost like skating. If I had skis, he murmured, I could fly. And he wondered how hard it would be to make a pair of skis, whittle them out of wood. Almost impossible. But his mind stayed on it, thinking on how he would cut a straight log and split it with the hatchet and carve it flat and somehow warp up the end, seeing it in his mind, visualizing each step. And he was so caught up in the idea of the skis that he almost missed it. A line. He had come about 3 miles and a bit more, working along the top of the ridges, when he could see further. There were hundreds of ponds and lakes scattered through the woods, and he wove between them, staying high. He saw 3 moose, more than a dozen deer, and hundreds of rabbits he could have shot, but he was trying to find some sign, something that would be out of the ordinary, and then there it was, a line. In the middle of the lake, more than a mile away below the ridge he was walking on, out from the ice, from the east to the west side of the lake, there was a line, a straight line. He saw it and didn't see it, looked away and kept walking, thinking of skis, and then stopped, did a long double take and looked again, and there it was, a straight line in the snow along the lake. Brian discovered that there was almost no straight lines in nature. The sides of the trees up and down, the horizon far away, but very little else. Animal tracks almost always wandered, circled. Seldom did they go straight for any distance. But this lake was a mile away. The line could be anything. He walked closer, watching it as he came off the ridge until the trees blotted out, and then picking up the pace, sliding the snowshoes over the hard surface as fast as he could until he saw it again. Not the lake this time, but through the trees ahead before going on to the line, before going on to the ice, that same line. Closer, he could see it. It was not just a line, but a depression in the snow that went along straight, and when it moved still closer, he could see that the depression was about 5 inches deep and about 2 feet wide. And at the bottom and in the bottom of it was smooth as packed ice, a flattened trail that went off the bank and out on the surface of the lake. It was almost definitely not a natural trail. Something had come along here, but there were no tracks, just smooth, flat, wide depression, and Brian squatted by the side of it and tried to visualize what made this path. Something came here, he thought. And no, not something, but somebody came here. A person, he thought, another person in the world. He had come to think there were no other people, and here was a strange track. Almost certainly a person had made it, but in what manner? Then he saw the edges of a print. On the side of the flattened area, just to the edge, there was a clear wolf print. It was as plain as if the wolf had stepped in plaster and made a cast. It was soft snow. From the warm weather, there was a wolf print, one, heading out to the lake. Somebody with a wolf? No, that didn't work. Somebody was walking, pulling something, and then along came an old wolf trail, covering the tracks, all but one. Pulling what? A toboggan of some kind? Somebody came along pulling a toboggan with an old wolf trail? Out here in the middle of the wilderness? Out here? It was insane. Brian wasn't sure where he was and had no true idea how far the plane had come off course before it crashed. But he was certain nobody could have pulled a toboggan from civilization out here. And for a second, he doubted that he was seeing what he was actually seeing, a track left by a person. Perhaps he was hallucinating. He shook his head, and it was still there, all of it. And if he was dreaming this or hallucinating, then he would have to hallucinate all of it. The wolves, the moose kill, the popping sounds. No, it was real. So what did he do? Follow the tracks, he thought. Don't be stupid. But which way? There was no indication from the flat surface of the track of any direction. Just the wolf print heading out onto the lake. Well, why not? That way was as good as any, and Brian set off, walking on the track itself, which was like a packed highway. If he was not particularly excited, it was because, in truth, some part of him did not believe what he was seeing, what he was doing. He crossed the lake and went into the woods on the far side, and there was no change, just the hard-packed trail ahead of him, and he kept moving, seeing the wolf prints more often, especially where the trail was curved around a tree, and prints would be on the other outside, and in this way he passed the day. Towards mid-afternoon he was hungry and stopped to eat from the meat in his pouch, eating snow to wash it down, and then he set off again. Just before dark he caught a smell he knew well, smoke, just a taint of a faint breeze that had come up. Some of the dry dead wood and a bit of pine, he thought, sniffing, and then it was gone. He kept walking, thinking he must be close now, or the wind had carried it far, and in the evening light he came around a corner, past a large evergreen, and was facing 4 wolves. Except they weren't. They looked like wolves at first, large slab-gray beasts in the dim light, but then he saw they were tied, their chains leading back to a tree. They were watching him come and wagging their tails, and then he knew they were dogs, 4 huge Malamutes. Then the one on the left whined softly and wiggled, trying to get him to come pet, and Brian stood there stunned. And when beyond the dogs he saw a crude log shelter covered in brush and a skin door. He looked. A Native American man with a rifle stepped out of the door and saw Brian and nodded. "It's you. I wondered when you'd come by." Brian stood mouth open. "We've got beaver cooking here, plenty for all of us. But how, why, who? Smelled your smoke 3 weeks ago. I didn't want to bother you. There's some in the bush who want to be alone. Figured you'd be here before this, but come on in." He turned and said something back into the shelter, and two small children came out and stood next to the man, and a woman looked over his shoulder. I don't know what to say, and Brian said, and he meant it. He hadn't spoken to a person. He had to stop and think. The days weren't there anymore. Always they had just been in the back of his mind. Every day they count, and now they were gone. The man disappeared back inside the hut, and Brian stood, the dogs whining softly, wiggling to be petted, and in a minute the man's head popped back out. Are you coming inside? Brian said it, and then stopped and kicked off his snowshoes and walked inside the hut.